Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of True Consequences Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and today we are going to be picking up on the final episode of the Crickett Coogler series. But before we get into that, I need to give some thanks. I want to thank Jackie Moranti for writing and researching this episode. I need to thank Wendy C., Christine D., and Connie C. for being my latest patron subscribers. I also need to thank Marie B., and Maureen C. for your generous KO-FI coffee support. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I couldn't make this show without you. I'm also excited to announce that I'm going to be on tour in Texas, September 22nd through the 25th. The link to tickets is below in the show notes. On September 22nd, I will be at Winehouse in Fort Worth with Cults Crimes Cabernet, True Crime Fan Club, and Gone Cold. On September 23rd, I will be in Dallas, Texas at Times 10 Cellar with Cults Crimes Cabernet and True Crime Fan Club. September 24th will take us to Austin. Cults Crimes Cabernet and myself will be at Wanderlust, East Austin. And on the 25th, myself and Cults Crimes Cabernet will be in Houston at Sable Gate Winery. Come hang out with us. Come enjoy some good food, good wine, and listen to some true crime. Okay, let's get into the case. Walt Finley, a reporter for the El Paso Herald-Post, began to cover Coogler's case when his editor, Mike Michaels, asked him to catch a bus on his day off and head to Las Cruces. He was tasked with checking on the rumors about Sheriff Apodaca's involvement in the murder. Finley spoke with Lloyd Huffstedler, Crickett's dry cleaner. Huffstedler told Finley that he cleaned Crickett's clothes on more than one occasion, and often the clothes were stained with a fair amount of blood. He spoke with Crickett's mother, Ollie Coogler, who told him that Crickett had been socially connected with Sheriff Apodaca and that the sheriff had often given her rides home. Finley noticed that Ollie was afraid to talk with him. He felt that she may have been holding back more information. Many others that he spoke with were also fearful. They didn't want to have their names associated with the case or with Crickett at all. They especially didn't want to be a target for Happy Apodaca. He had a reputation for making people's lives miserable if he felt that he had been slighted. But as Finley's stories began to appear in the paper, people found their voices, and more began to speak up about Apodaca and law enforcement in general. They were especially concerned that Crickett's murder hadn't been investigated properly. The citizens of Las Cruces had lost all confidence in law enforcement, and at one point, several people approached a former FBI agent who lived in Las Cruces at the time to see if the FBI could be brought in to investigate Crickett's murder. Shortly after her murder, Crickett's brother-in-law, Carl Bammert, had given Sheriff Apodaca the name of 3 suspects: Jerry Nussum, Luther Mosley, and Lauren Welch. He complained to the Las Cruces Sun-News that 3 days after he gave Apodaca the location that Mosley had been staying at in Hot Springs, the sheriff had yet to question him. Mosley also said that there had been no effort by Apodaca to contact him for questioning. Bammert also reported that he had found the car fitting the description of the one that Crickett had gotten into on the night of March 31st. Apodaca didn't follow up on that lead either. On May 7th, Walt Finley ran the story with the headline, "I was the fall guy," referring to the arrest of Jerry Nussum. Nussum hadn't been charged with anything, but his arrest caused an uproar in the local college community. About 300 students attended a mass meeting where they protested the injustice shown to Nussum and the failures by law enforcement in handling the Crickett Coogler case. Townspeople as well as students circulated a petition demanding that a grand jury investigate the murder. The petition had been signed by the mandatory 75 people, and then it was presented to Judge W.T. Scoggin, Jr. Scoggin questioned the legality of the petition since students weren't considered taxpayers. So, the petition went out again, and soon had over 100 signatures. Then Judge Scoggin announced that he would have to see if there was enough money in the coffers to form a grand jury. This outraged students even more. Some of them took to the library to study state law. That's how one of them found a legal precedent stating that if a petition had enough signatures to call for a grand jury, then a grand jury had to be called whether the county could afford it or not. There were no indictments for Crickett's murder, though. The grand jury was tasked instead with finding the discrepancies in the investigation of her murder. T.K. Campbell, the DA, and Byron Darden, a local attorney hired by Judge Scoggin to assist, reassured the public that the grand jury still had broad powers to explore all angles, including the circumstances surrounding Crickett's death. Reports of gambling in Doña Ana County and 3 previous attacks on women in Las Cruces, 2 teenagers and a Canadian woman who all claimed that Happy Apodaca was their assailant. The grand jury consisted of 12 men from all walks of life. They were Hal R. Cox, foreman of the jury and prominent ranch owner, Carol Angus Boggs, Salem merchant, James F. Vermillion, Las Cruces barber, Charles E. Neff Jr., Las Cruces tourist court operator, Alan Russell Soper, Hatch hotel operator, Henry Melendres, Las Cruces grocer, George W. Hay, Las Cruces farm equipment store manager, Parker F. Davenport, El Paso Electric Company, Las Cruces manager, Joe E. Jones, radio technician, R. A. Durio Jr., automobile mechanic, Robert C. Garcia, bar manager in the village of Doña Ana, and Edwin O. Cool, farmer. The hearings had a rough start. T.K. Campbell couldn't get himself together. He would get tongue-tied and would confuse information. R.A. Durio would later describe the first 2 weeks as being squandered on a lot of foolishness. When it takes 2 weeks to establish that the body was found in a certain spot and on with a lot of nothing, you are getting nowhere. So we hired 2 attorneys and then we got started. But all we could do was piece odds and ends together. The grand jury was a mix of lots of different people. Kind of like the army, you had no choice but to work with them. We met in the courthouse. Cox was the foreman, the most knowledgeable about how to run such a thing. The most important accomplishment of the grand jury was cutting down on the vice in the state. It was bad, very disappointing, however, that we didn't get to accomplish the primary job of finding out what happened to the girl. It was bad. It was very disappointing, however, that we didn't accomplish the primary job of finding out what happened to the girl. There was a complete cover-up. There were people interviewed who know who the murderer is. But if you can't get at the truth, then you can't. You can get some of them under oath and they will still lie to you. I think Crickett's death could have been accidental. End quote. But if Crickett's death was an accident, then why was everyone trying so hard to cover it up? Several county employees were brought before the grand jury. Russell Soper would later say that he felt that they were reluctant to talk, and their answers seemed coached. Jerry Nussum was brought in for questioning, as were several others who had tracked Crickett's movements on March 30th and 31st. Almost everyone had a different account of her movements that night. Stories had changed. The grand jury was getting nowhere. Then, the jury subpoenaed Happy Apodaca's bank account records. They showed several lump sums of money being deposited that were multiples of his salary. There were routine payments of $30 to $60 being deposited, but then in February of 1949, a deposit of $434 showed up. In March, a deposit of $388 was made. Apodaca was never asked to explain these deposits, but they were noted. Russell Soper later commented on Crickett's death and the person responsible. Quote, "Some heavy politicians were involved to the extent they tried to cover it up, and they did a very, very good job." End quote. The grand jury turned its attention to the illegal gambling that was going on in the county after several of Crickett's acquaintances mentioned that she had knowledge of the payoffs. So the jury took action against gambling in the county. On June 23, 1949, the grand jury conducted its own raids on Loma del Rey Club, the Valley Country Club, the Sunland Club, and the Anthony Country Club. At least one member of the grand jury accompanied police, and the raids struck simultaneously at 10 in the evening. Raids on these establishments had taken place before the grand jury convened, but by the time police arrived, everything would be cleaned up. It was obvious that there was a leak, and someone was tipping the owners off in advance. On June 12th, Judge Scoggin ordered a raid of the Las Cruces Elks Club, the VFW, and the Las Cruces Country Club. These clubs only had a couple of machines each and maybe a little bit of card gambling, so there really wasn't much to take in the raids. Scoggin had been completely bypassed by the grand jury on June 23rd. It was rumored that Scoggin was a leak all along. He was accused later of this by a confidential informant to the FBI, as well as to former Sheriff Santos Ramirez. After the June 23rd raids, Frank Ardovino, owner of the Loma del Rey, was found guilty of possessing and operating gambling equipment. He was fined $1,000 and sentenced to 5 months in county jail. Robert Milkman, owner of the Valley Country Club, was found not guilty. Barney Marcus, owner of the Sunland Club, was found guilty and fined $500 plus court costs. State Supreme Court Justice J.C. Compton ordered all 3 of these clubs closed until owners could prove to the court that they would not be used for illegal purposes. R.A. Durio would later tell journalists that he was sure that many people witnessed government payoffs. He himself had seen a man passing an envelope to a high-ranking official from Las Cruces while he was having dinner with his wife in El Paso. Vice raids began taking place statewide. Former New Mexico Secretary of State Cecilia Tafoya Porch, Tuffy Tafoya's sister, was arrested on April 18, 1950. She owned the Buckhorn Bar in a neighboring county. Tuffy, who was a state policeman at the time, was part owner of the bar. This was an obvious conflict of interest, but Tuffy wasn't cited for any wrongdoing. Next, the grand jury barred Judge W.T. Scoggin and D.A. T.K. Campbell from all grand jury proceedings. Then, they hired 2 outside attorneys, Bryden Darden and LaFell Oman. Shortly after, they began producing indictments and making recommendations. One of those indicted was State Corporation Commissioner Dan Cedillo. Cedillo appeared before the jury and read a prepared statement, but he didn't answer any questions that the jury asked. Lieutenant Governor Joseph Montoya's name was brought up, but he was not asked to account for his whereabouts on the night that Crickett Coogler disappeared. He was also not asked to respond to the stories that his office had checked out a state's vehicle to him for the days of March 30th and 31st. The grand jury also avoided asking him if the rumors of him owning half interests in the Anapra Club were true. As the jury closed its deliberations, they pled for a judge from outside the 3rd Judicial District to hear the report. Supreme Court Chief Justice Charles R. Bice appointed one of his justices, James McGee from Santa Fe, to receive the report. This took Scoggin out of the proceedings altogether. Justice McGee received a phone call the night before he went to Las Cruces to receive the report, saying that if he went, he'd go home in a casket. He went anyway. McGee arrived on June 23rd, and the next day, Sheriff Happy Apodaca was indicted on 10 counts, including gambling at the Las Cruces Country Club and Elks Club, permitting gambling at the Valley Country Club, adultery, failure to account for money coming into his hands as sheriff, demanding and receiving illegal fees, drinking on duty while transporting a suspect, gross immorality in the attempted seduction of a minor at the home of Joe DeTuro, as well as gross incompetence and negligence in the following matters. Number 1, allowing M.E. Garcia, County Commission Chairman, to enter the cell of Rosa P., a former Welcome Inn barmaid, and leaving them alone for about 30 minutes. Number 2, physically abusing Wesley Bird. Number 3, making no move to investigate gambling at the Palms liquor store until 10 p.m., although he was notified of gambling in process at 4:30 p.m. Number 4, allowing Justice of the Peace Ramon Duran to maintain an office in the sheriff's office. Number 5, removal of the contents of 3 jackpots from slot machines from the Mountain View Inn, which had been stored in the sheriff's office. Number 6, delivery of 2 slot machines to a person for use as gambling devices. Number 7, appointing V.D. Yelton a special deputy in spite of the fact that Yelton had been discharged as a game warden for conduct prejudicial to the U.S. and was currently under investigation. Number 8, failure to take steps to protect possible evidence at the scene of Crickett Coogler's initial burial site. Number 9, failing to contact Luther Mosley regarding the Coogler case. Number 10, locking visitors to the jail, Mary Nussum and Eloise Ellis in a cell for a short time. Number 11, grossly inadequate record-keeping in the Coogler case. For instance, there was no photographs, no incident reports, no statements, no disposition reports, and a failure to search the area where Crickett's shoes were found. The search that took place along Highway 80 was conducted by civilians. Number 12, gross inadequate records of the New Mexico A&M robbery case in which $11,804 were stolen from a safe. Number 13, 30-day delinquency in the records of the county jail. Number 14, delayed cleanup of the jail and refusal to take federal prisoners in the jail. Number 15, failing to keep facilities in the jail in good repair. Number 16, ordering deputies to desist from enforcing gambling laws. Number 17, failing to take any steps toward locating Crickett Coogler in the days immediately following her disappearance. Number 18, improper mileage reports. Number 19, ordering steak, butter, and eggs for the jail, not intended for prisoners for which the county was billed. 20, failure to seize the 17 slot machine stands at the Valley Country Club when the machines themselves were seized. It's not known why the stands were left or what significance this had. 22, failure to take action when Roy Sandman reported gambling equipment at the Del Rio bar. And number 22, failing to question important witnesses in the burglary at the New Mexico A&M College. Apodaca was removed from office temporarily pending trial. A removal trial would have to take place for Apodaca to be formally removed from office. Ben Martinez, who had been sent to Las Cruces to investigate the murder, was appointed in his place. The grand jury returned 29 more indictments, most for liquor law and gambling violations. Justice of the Peace Ramon Duran and TV Garcia were indicted. Duran for embezzling office fines and fees, and Garcia for gambling operations and impersonating a federal judge. Several others were indicted for selling liquor to minors, including Crickett Coogler. Since the investigation into her death prompted questions as to whether or not she had been drinking on the night of her disappearance. Dan Cedillo was indicted for morals charges involving sexual intent with Crickett Coogler. He couldn't avoid answering questions any longer. 8 other officials were criticized by the grand jury. Judge W.T. Scogan for failing to uphold gambling laws, D.A. T.K. Campbell for refusing to act on reports of serious criminal offenses, State Police Chief Hubert Beasley for drinking on duty and ignoring gambling laws, Las Cruces Police Chief Santos Ramirez for failure to ensure proper law enforcement, State Patrolman Carlos Salas for permitting gambling violations, State Patrolman I.E. Salazar for drinking on duty, Las Cruces policemen Ruben Flores and Vicente Lucero for gross neglect and incompetence, particularly in regard to the night of the disappearance of Crickett Coogler. The grand jury and lawyers they hired had experienced threats to themselves and their families while they convened. Cars were observed surveilling the neighborhoods that they lived in, and threatening calls were made to members. There was a lot at stake for the officials who were trying to cover up for the vice in Doña Ana County. But the grand jury would not be deterred. The closing statements from the grand jury's final report stated, quote, "The deplorable conditions into which law enforcement had fallen in Doña Ana County was apparent immediately at the beginning of our work. The records of the official investigation into the Crickett Coogler matter were extremely meager and of very little value to us. The officials themselves were able to add little to the records. It therefore became necessary for us to expend a great amount of time and effort to assemble background information and minor details which should and could have been far more easily obtained immediately after the occurrence of these offenses. Due to the long lapse of time, witnesses generally could not recall with any particular exactness the details, which would have been available with more certainty had prompt and thorough investigations been made when these matters first became known. We sincerely regret that we were unable to determine just who were the responsible parties for these crimes. We trust that investigations will continue until the guilty parties are brought before the bar of justice. We most strongly and sincerely urge the citizens of Doña Ana County to never again permit the existence of conditions so prejudicial to their rights and welfare as prevailed in our county during the first part of 1949. End quote. In the end, the grand jury couldn't find Crickett's killer, but that wasn't their job. What they did do was clean up the political corruption and illegal gambling in Doña Ana County and possibly the entire state. Ollie Coogler wrote a note of appreciation to the foreman of the jury, Hal Cox. It said, quote, "It is always difficult to say the words of gratitude that a person would like to say in appreciation for services made by fellow men. But please accept this note of thanks in all sincerity from myself and my family for all the kindness you showed us." End quote. The grand jury was probably the only entity in all of Doña Ana County that showed the Cooglers any kindness. For many years before 1949, New Mexico had been a one-party state. Politicians had either bought their way in or stole their way into power. Backs were scratched from the governor's office down to the sheriff's office to ensure that the right people got into office. Many of them were related to one another, either by blood or marriage. Ultimately, the nepotism and cronyism led to the murder of an 18-year-old girl and the corruption of the entire state of New Mexico. The checks and balances that make governments run correctly were all out of sync. It took the murder of Crickett Coogler to make that house of cards tumble down. It wasn't a secret that gambling, illegal drinking, illicit sex, and other things were going on. Everyone knew it, and it was accepted by everyone. And you might say, well, Eric, what about those law-abiding citizens of New Mexico? If they weren't willing to do anything about it, they basically accepted it, right? That was until the murder of Crickett Coogler. They didn't take notice until they realized her death was part of a huge cover-up by the government that was keeping all the vices intact. The bottom line was money. Huge amounts of money. And the citizens of the state began to realize that if this could happen to Ollie Coogler's daughter, it could happen to their own daughters as well. Walt Finley later speculated that Crickett Coogler couldn't have been the only girl in the area that the men were after. She was pretty, but no raving beauty. There must have been women closer to Santa Fe that would have sufficed for a night of sex and partying. Then one of Crickett's friends told him a story that shocked him. It implied that Crickett was willing to tolerate mean, ugly things to happen. Quote, Dan Cedillo and Happy Apodaca had tied Crickett to a table in a motel at some time. Another girl had been present. End quote. Did she know how high it went? Did she threaten someone with divulging the secrets that she kept if she didn't get something more out of it? 3 weeks before her death, she had told a friend that she and another girl accompanied 2 high-ranking officials to Juarez for an evening. She would never say who she was with. If Crickett had come forward and told stories of her abuse, would that have saved her life, or would she have been killed anyway? On June 8th, 1949, Happy Apodaca was accused in the news of several sexual assaults. Sam Pearson, a former Las Cruces city judge, told reporters about a Canadian woman who was in the U.S. seeking treatment for tuberculosis. The paper reported that shortly after the disappearance of Crickett Coogler, the woman came forward and said that she had accepted a ride to the El Paso immigration office with a Las Cruces police officer to extend her passport and visa since they had run out. The Las Cruces police officer offered to make the return trip with her, but then drove her off the road, severely injured her, and then raped her twice. She identified her attacker as Happy Apodaca. Pearson said he reported the attack to DA T.K. Campbell, who took no action. Pearson said that for reasons of his own health, he didn't take up the case against Apodaca. The woman also identified T.K. Campbell as the man who refused to hear her case, claiming that it couldn't be true since she hadn't reported it as soon as it happened. After that, the woman wouldn't return to New Mexico from Canada for a trial because she feared for her life. She said that she had been threatened by someone, but she would not say who. On June 17, 1949, another victim came forward, 17-year-old Alicia C. She claimed that Apodaca had sexually assaulted her on 3 separate occasions at the home of Joe DeTuro. Shortly after this, Roy Sandman resigned his position as chief deputy to take another position in law enforcement. He accused Apodaca of not allowing him to investigate the Coogler case the way that he wanted to. This implied that he was not allowed to investigate her murder correctly. On June 24th, yet another of Apodaca's victims came forward. Romelia C. was only 15 at the time. She reported that Apodaca had tried to seduce her when she was babysitting at the DeTuro home. Apodaca already had several charges leveled against him, but rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor were added. The night before Apodaca was indicted, he stormed into the hotel room of Walt Finley. Apodaca brandished a pistol at him and threatened to shoot him. Finley said that he was scared to death, but he did say to Happy, quote, "Well, now, Happy, you can kill me, but if you do, Scripps Howard will send in a good reporter." End quote. Apodaca holstered the gun, told Finley to get out of town by morning, and left. Finley didn't leave town the next morning or any other for a very long time. On September 12th, Apodaca's removal trial began in Silver City. Judge C. Roy Anderson presided. At one point during the proceedings, Aurelia McFarland, a former bus ticket agent at the Tortugas Cafe, told a story about a night a few weeks before Crickett disappeared. She said that she, Crickett, Apodaca, Dan Cedillo, and Rufus Cedillo were drinking excessively and spent some time at a motel. According to McFarland, that was the night that Crickett was tied to a table and raped several times by the men. On the afternoon of September 17th, after 20 hours of deliberation, the jury was dismissed when it failed to yield a verdict. Unanimity was a requirement, and the jury was deadlocked at a vote of 7-5. Judge Anderson declared a mistrial, and Happy Apodaca walked. Judge Anderson immediately scheduled a new trial for October 18th in the city of Tucumcari. Apodaca would face charges on 6 counts and would be tried separately for the rape charges. On October 6th, Happy Apodaca was back in his original position as sheriff of Doña Ana County. But 5 days later, he resigned as part of an agreement that all charges be dropped, both civil and criminal. So Happy avoided all of it, including the rape charges. On October 6th, Happy was back in his original position as sheriff of Doña Ana County. But 5 days later, he resigned as part of an agreement that all charges be dropped, both civil and criminal. So he avoided all of it, including the rape charges. Edwin Meacham was elected the first Republican governor to hold office since 1933. He ran on the promise that Crickett's case would be reopened and solved. Jerry Nussum was the most likely suspect at the time since he was one of the last people to be seen with Crickett, so Meacham put his attention on him. This time, Nussum would be tried for murder. During the first week of May 1949, Jerry Nussum was approached by a state patrolman stationed in Clovis who asked him to come to Las Cruces for questioning in Crickett's death. Nussum would proclaim his innocence despite the state police accusations that he had run over Crickett with his car several times. The cart was taken to Santa Fe where it was disassembled. The officers who were performing the task said that they found blood on the right spring and the rear spring of the car and a strip of human flesh about 6 inches long under the car. Jerry would later say that the car had been washed several times before it was taken to Santa Fe for inspection, and Happy Apodaca admitted to running over a chicken between Las Cruces and Santa Fe while taking the car in for inspection. At the time, D.A. Campbell didn't press charges against Nussum. When Nussum asked the DA if he should get a lawyer, Campbell told him that if he did, they'd have to charge him with murder. So, Nussum voluntarily sat in jail. He was found innocent of all charges and released on May 10th. He thought it was over. He thought he could go back to living his life, so he moved to Pittsburgh to play for the Steelers. And then D.A. Campbell announced, quote, "Jerry Nussum has definitely been cleared of in any way of being at fault or having any guilty knowledge of the death of Ovida Coogler. And insofar as this office is concerned, is completely exonerated." End quote. But the nightmare would begin all over again 2 years later. On April 5th, 1951, Jerry Nussum was approached and arrested by State Police Captain Albert H. Hathaway and Patrolman Tuffy Tafoya. Nussum waived extradition and returned voluntarily to Las Cruces to face murder charges in the death of Crickett Coogler. The proceedings were very strange, and Jerry again felt like he was the fall guy. The grand jury never indicted Jerry Nuzum. The DA never prosecuted Jerry Nuzum. There was no evidence against him. Yet, here he was, on trial for murder. The same stories were told with critical details either missing or changed. New details were added, and in the middle of it all, the burglary at the A&M campus came up as evidence against Jerry. He had never been a suspect in that burglary. Neither was Crickett. In the end, he was found not guilty. They couldn't arrest him again for that charge. After Nuzum's trial, Governor Meacham announced that the investigation into the Coogler case would go on, but would be substantially scaled back. He said the state didn't have enough money or manpower to sustain a full investigation. So much for his promise of finding her killer. Dan Cedillo was the highest-ranking officer questioned in the Coogler case. However, he was never named a suspect. Based on testimony from other witnesses, he was indicted by the grand jury on July 29, 1949, for an incident that occurred on December 7, 1948. He was indicted on 2 counts, the first being that he gave Crickett Coogler liquor. She was a minor at the time. The second, that he had her in his possession for evil purposes with the intent of sexually molesting her, and that he remained alone with her in the motel room until after midnight on the night of question. Dan Cedillo would later tell reporter Walt Finley that many men had possessed Crickett with evil intent, but he was singled out on the indictment. He claimed that he had been discriminated against based on rumor, malice, public clamor, and personal influence. The implication was that he wasn't the only guy who had been with Crickett, but he was the one taking the rap for all of it. His trial began on November 9, 1949. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Dan Cedillo in Las Cruces on the night Crickett disappeared, but Cedillo would say that he was in Midland, Texas with Lieutenant Governor Joe Montoya at the time. On January 4, 1950, Cedillo was found not guilty. It was surmised that Crickett could have been murdered because she was involved in the burglary at A&M, but there was nothing to support that claim. The burglary had been discovered by a janitor in the early morning hours after the robbery had taken place. The combination lock on the safe had been drilled out and filled with lead. A small window was found broken in the room. The window was only big enough for a very small person to get through, and Crickett was very small. But there was never any evidence that she was involved in that robbery. So much happened during the Coogler case that Crickett got lost. By the time it was all over, her killer was never found, and no one could even really say that she was murdered. It seems like most of the time, she was forgotten entirely, just to cover up the wrongdoings of others. Her death might have done that. It seems like most of the time, she was forgotten entirely in order to bring others' wrongdoings to light. Her death might have done that. It might have cleaned up New Mexico politics for a while, and it may have kept Santa Fe from becoming what Las Vegas is now. But through all of it, a life was lost, a victim was forgotten, and a murder was never solved. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, New Mexico.